Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us for the second to last webinar for the 23-24 school year. Thank you for being here tonight. The National Council for Geographic Education believes that geography education is a bridge to a better understanding and appreciation of all subject matters. NCGE is a nonprofit organization that's committed to ensuring that all students graduate with the knowledge, perspectives, and skills to make informed decisions as they go through life. They support all educators in their desire to create engaging, authentic, inquiry-based learning experiences for students at all levels. And I'm excited tonight to be here with Daniel Neep and our partnership with the Institute of Middle East Studies. He's going to share with us some of his research in Syria, a very timely, unfortunately timely event, and that's been going on. We were just talking about how long it's been going on and what his research is. He's been in many publications and is working on his second book. So Daniel, thank you for being here with us tonight, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak to you today. So I should say a little bit, I think, about my perspective and where I'm coming from before I start the talk. Firstly, I am trained as a political scientist. I specialize on the Middle East. And what I'm interested in is the long-term development of states and societies in the Middle East. So often I find myself speaking with historians, and often I find myself speaking with geographers, as well as political scientists. The second thing I should say is that before I became a political scientist in my graduate studies, I was already a Syria person. I started studying the Middle East as an undergraduate. I went to Syria to study Arabic. As an undergraduate, I kept on going back. I spent about 5 years living in Syria, including during the first year of the revolution. I left in 2012. And I think that this long-term immersion in the country and living in Syria through so many different periods, periods of relative authoritarian stability, periods of reform, periods of great upheaval, and the kind of long-standing connections I have, which are not just professional, but also personal. That gives me perhaps a different perspective on the country than you might expect to hear. So I can't profess to speak for Syrians. I would never do that. But I try not to look at the Middle East as a distant arena for US foreign policy. I'm not interested in the bigger strategic picture. I'm much more interested in what politics looks like for Syrians in their everyday lives, what politics feels like on the ground. And I think that perspective informs the analysis I want to present to you today. I should also add, as a third point about myself, that I am not, in fact, Australian. I'm originally from the UK, so if you hear an accent, that's what it is. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully share my slides with you. Hopefully you can see that. So what I want to talk to you today about is really looking at the origins of the conflict in Syria, looking at the beginnings of the uprising in the country in 2011, and thinking about different ways that scholars have used to explain the uprising, the different arguments that are presented, the different types of evidence that are used to explain the origins of what was at the time quite an unlikely and unpredicted event. Syria has sadly disappeared, I think, from the global consciousness, particularly since the events of the global pandemic, the invasion of Ukraine, and more recently events in Gaza. Yet the conflict in Syria has been raging now for 13 years. The human cost has been quite incredible. The country has been shattered. Millions of people have been displaced. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. On a personal note, I lived in Syria for 5 years. Every single person I ever considered a friend has fled the country. The cost of this conflict has been immense. So I really do want to take a moment, I think, to reassert the importance of understanding what's going on in Syria, even though it has fallen off the radar. What I'm going to talk about, as I mentioned, is how did the revolt break out in Syria in the first place. When the Arab uprisings began, first in Tunisia in December 2010, and in Egypt in January 2011, it was not a foregone conclusion that protests and revolutions would sweep the region and would reach Syria. For many people in Syria, Syria seemed to be in a different category than the categories of Egypt and Tunisia, particularly for the Syrian regime. The Syrian regime, by early 2011, was feeling quite confident. It had exited a period of international isolation, which had been led by the US following Syria's role in smuggling militants into Iraq to fight the US occupation in Iraq, and also following Syria's involvement in the assassination of the Lebanese prime minister in 2005. So Syria had actually just about exited this period of international isolation. President Obama had been elected. The withdrawal from Iraq was on the cards. The US had just sent its ambassador back to Syria in January 2011. The British foreign minister had also visited for the first time in several years. So Syria is coming out of this period of international isolation. The Syrian regime felt that in terms of its economic situation, it wasn't doing too badly. There'd been some very difficult economic reforms they pushed through. They thought they were had seen the worst of those impacts of those reforms. The hard work had been done in effect. And they also felt that Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, was in a different category from the presidents of Tunisia and Egypt, who'd been there for decades, who are part of a much older generation, who are part of this older gerontocracy in the region that the youth was fighting against. Syria had a younger president who'd been in power just 10 years. They'd already undergone that generational shift. And Bashar was seen by many of his people as a reformer. That's how he presented himself. That's how he was understood. And in terms of legitimacy, which is an awkward term to use, but the Syrian regime certainly felt that their opposition to the US, their opposition to what they would refer to as American imperialism and European imperialism in the region, their opposition to Israel, very much struck a chime with the broader population. Unlike the regimes in Egypt, which had been long criticized by their populations for making peace with Israel and being so close to the US, that there was very little daylight between them. So Syria seemed to be in a different category. Of course, that did not turn out to be true. The uprisings began in Syria in March 2011 and very rapidly reached across the country. In the wake of those developments, scholars as well as journalists, as well as think tankers, have put forward a variety of different explanations for explaining why this took place. What was it that made the revolution possible in Syria? They have put forward, and I want to explore some of these explanations with you today. They've put forward explanations based on religion, based on history, based on the environment, climate change, based on the nature of Syrian society, based on the nature of the economy and economic reforms. So what I want to do is to focus on these 5 approaches to understanding the Syrian revolution and take a look at what we can learn from each of them, and what shortcomings each of these approaches, what are their blind spots, what don't they explain? So to start off, what I want to do is just to kind of give a little bit of background on Syria. I'm not assuming that everyone's an expert, so I just want to make sure we all are on the same page about the developments that are relevant for understanding Syrian politics today. So very conveniently, Syria has been run by the same family for over 50 years. My master's students, my undergrads, always appreciate the fact that they die in years with round numbers. So from 1970 to 2000, we had the father, Hafez al-Assad, and in 2000, his son, Bashar, took over, which is perfectly normal in a republic, of course. Was not without, I'll talk about the secession in a minute, but this generational shift, this generational transition was seen as, I think, for the regime at least, confirming the legitimacy of the system it had set up, which was very much the system that Bashar had inherited, had very much been built by his father in the 1970s. Prior to the Assads coming to power, Syria, after independence, underwent a period of very intense political instability and polarization. And what's interesting from today's perspective is that this instability and polarization was not built on ethnicity or sect. This was not a factor in the 50s and 60s. The political instability was all about the left and the right. What we had in Syria was an elite, an urban elite, bourgeoisie, big landowners who owned vast swathes of the countryside, and a very large class of impoverished peasants. So there's almost extreme levels of inequality in land ownership, almost a feudal-like system. This elite that had been political and economic, social elites based in the cities that had been there for decades, and a mass of the population which was beginning to push back against this system with the spread of more left-wing ideas, and the spread of modern schooling, the spread of the beginnings of modernization and so forth. So the 50s and 60s saw instability, swings between these two different blocks within the parliament, particularly because the leftist forces were becoming represented primarily within the armed forces, within the military. So in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, Syria was really a byword for military coups. In 1949, there were 3 military coups before. So we had power going backwards and forwards between the armed forces, between different leftist factions, and the civilian bourgeois politicians. In 1963, we had a coup by the Ba'ath Party, which brought the Ba'ath Party into power for the first time. It continues to rule to this day. The Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party was based on an idea of Arab nationalism. That is the idea that the different Arab states had been created by colonialism and should form a united Arab state, a unified Arab state. It was also a socialist party. Land reform, in particular, was an extremely important part of its platform. That meant it gained support across these large segments of the peasantry against the urban elites. And interestingly, because it drew its support from the peasantry, it meant its support reached out into different communities in Syria. The Sunni community, different minorities who were primarily overrepresented amongst the peasants. So it was a party of minorities, as well as Sunni peasants, and a party of the impoverished rural masses. When it came to power in the 60s, it was the radical wing of the party that came to power, the most left-wing, most socialist, engaged in a wave of nationalizations, nationalizing banks and hotels and tourism, very 1960s stuff. In 1970, after 7 years of internal fighting between different wings of the Ba'ath Party, the more radical wing of the party was ousted by Hafiz al-Assad and his corrective movement. This is the name he gave to his coup. Assad presided over a more pragmatic turn, who is more moderate compared to the people who came right before him. There was a relative opening to business. He stopped nationalizing and appropriating the private property of the business elites, at least. There was a professionalization of the armed forces. Rather than backing Palestinian guerrillas, Assad placed his faith in conventional armed forces and was a little bit more circumspect in the conflict with Israel, a little bit more rational, a little bit more calculated, a little more less provocative than his immediate predecessors. The idea of unifying the Arab world under a single state, which had very much driven politics for over the previous decades, was replaced by a more Syria first policy, an acceptance, at least a de facto acceptance of the borders as they were, and this idea that the Syrian state should be, that politics should be about Syrian interests rather than the Arab national interests as a whole. Very usefully, after 1973, Syria benefited from an oil boom. The oil boom, which went to producers in the Gulf, benefited Syria because of its frontline status in the conflict with Israel. Lots of aid coming in from Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, which allowed Syria to undergo a fairly rapid period of development, modernization, and urbanization. It was Assad very much who was credited with bringing electricity to the rural villages, to bringing water, to bringing roads, to launching a wave of real estate construction that brought the peasants into the cities for the first time. and broke down some of these barriers between the rural and the urban that had been built over previous decades. So for these reasons, if there is any legitimacy to which Assad could claim in the 70s, it was very much the legitimacy of being a modernizer, of bringing economic development to populations that had previously been excluded from progress. The regime that Assad built was based on 6 pillars. I think I listed 6 anyway. Firstly, into positions of high authority, particularly in the armed forces and in the security forces, that's the intelligence services, Assad placed primarily, but not only, Alawi loyalists. These are the members of his own ethno-religious community. I'll talk more about those in a moment. It wasn't an exclusively Alawi regime, but certainly those people into key positions were people with whom Assad shared a similar background, similar communal ties. He expanded the Ba'ath Party, which had been previously a vanguard party in the Leninist tradition, a small cadre of ideologically dedicated individuals who would seize the state and bring about a revolution from above. Assad reversed that and made it a party for the masses, expanded its membership to hundreds of thousands of people, and in doing so, diluted the ideological component and made it much more of a routine part of the government bureaucracy. You became a member of the Ba'ath Party if you were a civil servant or a teacher, if you wanted to progress within your employment, if you're an state employee. So membership of the Ba'ath Party became a vehicle for career advancement. It lost its ideological edge, and many critics within the Baathism kind of decried the loss of this. It opened up the ranks to opportunists and careerists. It lost what made it special. So the Ba'ath Party became a way to incorporate many more people into the system, which was kind of clever. The state institutions, the government bureaucracy was also massively expanded this time. State employment became a really important way to ensure the loyalty of large sections of the population in the absence of a vibrant private sector. Syria also created what are called in Syria popular organizations, that is, state-run unions, syndicates, associations for different professional organizations. So we have a peasants union, which is extremely important. We have a union for teachers. We have a women's union. We have a lawyers syndicate. We have different state-run corporatist type organizations that are set up in a way that is, although they're sort of being top down, they're controlled by the regime, they do actually, in some instances, allow a certain flow of political, not quite demands, but they allow a certain set of interests to be articulated sometimes, which is kind of interesting, right? We often think of authoritarian regimes as being very tightly controlled by a certain set of individuals. But in this case, authoritarianism had very complex institutions, was an institutional texture. The Peasants' Union, for example, could make recommendations and lobby for policies that were in the interests of the peasants who made up that union. They could push back against liberalization measures and so forth. So although it's a top-down authoritarianism, the popular organizations also allowed it some feeding of pressures up to the top. State-led industrialization, the government had major plants in everything from running steel to concrete, paper mills, and so forth. Another really important way of providing employment, but also a way of avoiding imports from the outside. Syria aimed to produce many of its own products itself. There was a certain opening to the rich businessmen alongside this, a very limited opening to particular regime cronies, if you like, very big businessmen who are allowed to take over monopolies in certain limited sectors, such as tourism, hotels, transportation, and so forth. This is important because this is very much a strategy that his son continued afterwards. And finally, repression. Let's not forget repression. Violence was not used in I wouldn't say an arbitrary way in the way it was used in Iraq under Saddam Hussein, but certainly the regime had no compunctions about using every means at its disposal in order to ensure its own survival. This was most vividly seen in the biggest challenge that the regime faced from 1976 to 1982. The regime faced what began as very widespread opposition from the secular left, and also encompassed the religious right. The secular left, the regime was able to silence quite quickly. Many of the individuals and activists who were jailed at this time and placed into terrible conditions, disappeared into Syrian jails for 10, 20 years, only to emerge in the 2000s as became the elder statesmen of the revolution afterwards. After suffering torture and so forth. There's a very rich literature, of rich strain of Syrian prison literature, which is absolutely terrifying, but gives great insights into what life was like in these regime-held prisons. The insurgency was led by a militant offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Syrian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, which accused the regime of being infidels, of not being good Muslims, and launched a campaign of assassinations, terrorist attacks, explosions, targeting regime personnel across the country, sweeping to various towns and cities across the north of the country in the late 70s and early 80s. The regime responded very brutally. It pioneered some of the techniques that have been used since 2011, going into different urban neighborhoods, cordoning them off, going through house by house, shooting opposition that they encountered, and so forth. After one particular incident, just to give you a sense of the type of brutality that went on, after one failed assassination attempt on the president's life in 1980, the president's brother, Rifat al-Assad, personally led the massacre of over 550 Islamist prisoners at the city of Palmyra, in a very brutal massacre which lasted just a very short time. The uprising came to a head in the city of Hama in the center of Syria in 1982. Insurgents seized control of the city. The regime surrounded it and leveled the entire center of the city. We don't know how many people were killed. I've seen estimates anywhere as low as 5,000 up to 20,000. I've seen higher estimates as well. Unlike today, of course, there were no mobile phones at the time, very few pictures. News of this massacre atrocity emerged several days later and very slowly made its way to the outside world. The entire center of the city was leveled and rebuilt over the bodies of those who were killed. The ferocity and the brutality with which this uprising was repressed across the country meant two things. Firstly, that the Muslim Brotherhood was eradicated from Syria. Membership was punishable by death. It was eradicated from the country as an opposition force. In fact, all opposition in Syria was repressed during this time. Syrians found it impossible to organize any kind of, even in secret, to mount any kind of organized opposition to the regime. There was no space for political mobilization. This is in contrast to places like Egypt, right? Even under Mubarak's regime in the 80s and the 90s, there was a certain space that was allowed to the opposition to take part in local politics or to contest some parliamentary elections and so forth. Trade unions were allowed a certain independence. None of this space existed in Syria. It was all repressed extremely heavily. If you think of the impact that has on civil society, that's going to be quite profound. A Syrian sociologist named Burhan Ghalioun, who lived in the 80s and 90s in France, he said back in 1986, in fact, and he predicted, it sounds like a prediction listening to it today. He said, if this wall of fear protecting the regime should ever crumble, the regime's erosion of all forms of social justice, equality, and solidarity would produce not a democratic transition, he said, but violence and the collapse of the rule of law at the hands of people who had been stripped of their humanity and who harbored despair. So there's a sense in which, certainly for Syrians who are opposed to the regime, they felt, as Ghalioun said, stripped of their humanity. They felt like bonds of social solidarity had been completely shattered. And I think that sense of repression is extremely important for understanding how amazing the uprising was, how incredible it was that it took place, and how unpredicted it was. When Bashar came to power in 2000, again, it was something of a surprise. His elder brother Basil was being groomed to take over. He was killed in a fast car accident in 1994. Apparently, it wasn't actually an accident. He drove too fast on the road to the airport and couldn't maintain control of his vehicle. Bashar had been in London, being trained to be a eye doctor, in fact, and was summoned back home to take over the family business. He didn't seem the personality type that was cut out to be the number one son was the stereotypical dictator's son. Bashar was a little bit more nervous, a little bit more awkward, and a little bit less obviously well suited for this role. He went back into the military, was given a suspiciously rapid promotion. He went through the ranks very quickly, had nothing to do with who he was, of course. He was given control of the Lebanon file, looking after Syrian interests in Lebanon, which Syria was occupying at that time. Didn't have any formal government position. He was chair of the Syrian Computer Society, gives you a hint of his interest in modernization. When his father died, the constitution was quickly amended so that Bashar, who was, according to the constitution, too young to be president, they amended the constitution so that wasn't an obstacle. And he gave in his inaugural speech in 2000 a very surprising speech, in which he talked about, he didn't speak with the usual Arab nationalist, overblown, bombastic rhetoric that was familiar from his father. He spoke about a need for change, about a need for reform. He spoke about the need to bring in transparency and accountability and make policy that was based on evidence and data. This is very odd. This was a very odd type of language to use in the Syrian parliament. He sounded like a consultant for the World Bank more than he sounded like a typical Syrian politician. So already, although this was a very long and meandering speech, there was already a different tone he was striking. And in the 2000s, it seems odd to look back at it now, but Bashar was seen as a reformer and taken fairly seriously as a reformer by many people. There was a short-lived Damascus Spring after Bashar first came to power. Some of the older secular elites started organizing political salons, they called them, discussion groups, at which they came very close to talking about the red lines of the day, of talking about politics in a way that was much more open and frank than had ever been allowed in the past. This was a very short-lived Damascus Spring, which was clamped down upon once it had seemed to be too close to these red lines. Nevertheless, Bashar pressed on, removed the key supporters of his father, who was called at the time the Old Guard, and replaced them with a different generation. A generation that was younger, that was modern, that was reformist, that was open-minded, many technocrats, for example, people with whom it seemed to be on the same page as him in terms of bringing Syria more up to date. And in the first decade of the century, we had quite incredible, albeit to some extent superficial changes took place in Syria. We had the growth of social freedoms, we had the growth of new restaurants, we had the beginnings of a kind of consumer culture. We had a lot more opening to the import of goods from the outside world in the West. You could suddenly buy Pepsi Cola in Damascus, where it was very difficult to find in the 1990s. New cars started appearing on the streets of the major cities because they weren't being taxed too heavily by the import duties. NGOs were being founded at a very rapid rate. Something like 600 new NGOs were founded during Bashar's first few years in power, which is more than had been founded in the previous 4 decades. So we had a real growth of civil society during this time. His wife, Asma al-Akhras, who was a Syrian born in the UK, brought up and educated in the UK, had worked in, I forget which investment bank it was now, but had worked in banking in the UK, was very much seen as this glamorous face of the regime. Vogue did this spread on her, calling her a rose in the desert, in which she talked about her family life and how she ran her family as a democracy. It appeared just as the revolution was starting in Syria and was very quickly pulled by Vogue. But she also spearheaded many of these initiatives, taking over kind of government organized NGOs in the fields of rural development, youth, microfinance, and this kind of thing. So the assets themselves were very, personally seen as being the face of these new changes. In 2005, they started introducing big economic reforms, introducing what they call the social market economy. I'll talk about that in a second, rolling back the state from the economy and opening up more space for the private sector. So in the 2000s, all this seemed to be moving forwards. And as I mentioned, by early 2011, the regime seemed confident that it was fairly safe. Of course, this didn't happen. Protests broke out. Excuse me. Protests broke out in February and March 2011. And very quickly, the regime pursued what it referred to as what was referred to as a security solution, which involved taking, involved sniper fire against protesters, involved besieging areas where the protests had occupied important parts of cities. Military defections from the regime began the more that the regime armed forces were used against protesters who were, for the most part, unarmed. We had the military defections. We had the defections of armed units, army units to defend against, to protest the orders that were being given. We had local residents taking up arms against the army. We have the beginnings of this armed resistance. And by the time we get to early 2012, the regime is using its armed forces with absolutely devastating effect against civilian neighborhoods. And regime-backed militias are perpetrating sectarian massacres. So a very quick descent into the spiral of violence. So what I want to do is talk about 5 different types of explanation that have been put forward for why this took place. We have the religious explanation that focuses on sectarian enmity. We have a historical explanation that focuses on the idea that this was inevitable because Syria is an artificial state. We have an environmental argument that says this is really a consequence of climate change. We have a political economy argument saying this is really a consequence of the free market reforms that I just mentioned. And we have more of a social movement type explanation that says, actually, what's going on? It's about the nature of Syrian society and the way in which society was mobilized once the protests began. And that's the best way to understand why the protests spread so quickly. So really, we're focusing on these early months in the first year or so of the revolution, try and get a sense of what makes the best sense of what explains why people went out against the regime for the first time in so long, after the consequences back in 1982 had been so calamitous for the opposition. The first, religion. Now, this is a type of explanation that is very prominent. We heard this a lot about 10 years ago from a variety of different politicians. President Obama talked about how ancient sectarian differences could explain the conflict in Syria. He said that ancient divisions propelled instability in the Arab world, which is rooted in conflicts that date back millennia. Ted Cruz said that Sunnis and Shias have been engaged in sectarian civil war since 632. Mitch McConnell explained that what is going on in the Arab world is a religious conflict that has been going on for a millennium and a half. George Mitchell, former US Middle East peace envoy, amongst other things, talked again about the Sunni-Shia split, which began as a struggle for power following the death of Muhammad, is what's going on. He said that's what's going around the world. Huge factor in Iraq, now in Syria and in other countries. Thomas Friedman, similarly, said that the main issue in the Middle East was the 7th century struggle over who is the rightful heir to the Prophet Muhammad, Sunnis or Shia. To be fair, I always tell my students that if they are ever in doubt about what's going on in the Middle East, just pick the opposite argument from Tom Friedman and they'd probably be on safe ground. Sarah Palin, remember her, said that the best path, she had a very concise way forward for US foreign policy. She said, let Allah sort it out. So even Sarah Palin was using this type of religious rhetoric, perhaps unsurprisingly. As you might expect from my tone, I'm not a big fan of this type of explanation, but let's look why. Let's look why this explanation doesn't explain very much about Syria. Firstly, Syria is extremely diverse in its religious and ethnic composition. The majority of the population is Sunni Muslim, but that encompasses both Arabs and Kurds. There's a big Kurdish minority, which is primarily Sunni Muslim, and I'll show you maps in a minute, show you where all these people are located. The Alawis, who I mentioned before, which is the community that the president comes from, it's sometimes described as a heterodox Shia sect, or not entirely accurate. But the Alawis have an interesting belief system. They are a small group whose belief system combines elements of esoteric Shia philosophy with kind of mysticism, with elements of Gnosticism, paganism, Neoplatonism, local folk traditions. So over the years, these different beliefs have meshed into it's actually a mystery cult. The innermost secrets of the religion of the sect are only communicated to men who are over a certain age, who are religious sheikhs and so forth. So the regular Alawis don't actually know the ins and outs of the faith. They have various beliefs which are considered to be by certain Sunni Muslims to place them outside the realm of Islam. So that's the key element there. And over time, the Alawis have, because of the relatively close nature of the community and because of their geographical isolation, over years, and the practice of breeding, of marrying within the community, means that they have acquired essentially the characteristics of an ethnic group. So theology for Alawis is not the motivating factor, but ethnic identity is. Similarly, the Druze, who are located in the southeast of Syria primarily, also have non-standard Islamic beliefs, including, for example, reincarnation, which is not a very Islamic belief, not for the mainstream anyway. And again, the Druze have a very similar sense in which the innermost secrets of their sect are reserved to the religious sheikhs, who have a very important place in the Druze community. And the Druze, again, because it's based in a relatively compact geographical area in Syria, have also acquired over time the characteristics of an ethnic group. So when we talk about religion and ethnicity, these two terms overlap very much. We also have Ismailis, who are a Shia sect, that's generally accepted. We have a small number of Shia within Syria. We have quite a variety of different Christian groups. Greek Orthodox, probably the most popular, also Greek Catholics, Syriac Orthodox and Syriac Catholics, a large number of Armenians living in different parts of Syria. We have Circassians and Turkmen, who are Sunni Muslim, but who are the descendants of populations. The Circassians fled territories that were recaptured by Russia during the Ottoman Empire and so forth. Big numbers of Palestinian refugees who fled to Syria in 1948 and after 1967. Large number of Iraqis went to Syria after 2003, also displaced Golanis from the Golan Heights, which was captured by Israel in 1967. So, a very diverse population in Syria. So, as I mentioned, the idea that this is simply a religious conflict doesn't work. Let's take a look at just how complicated things get if you look at where the population is actually located in Syria, where people live. What this map shows is population density. The higher the towers, the greater the density per, I think it's square kilometer. I can send you the source for this. And you get a sense of just how densely a populated area the Syrian population lives, very much clinging to the coast of Syria. The further you get east from the Mediterranean, the less the rain penetrates. After you get a little bit east of Damascus, you hit the steppe. After that, large areas of steppe, relatively uninhabitable land, right up until you get to the Euphrates River. Then you have the population, trickling down the Euphrates River. You can see it going into Iraq there, so forth. You see it just by contrast. You see how tightly the population of Egypt is into the Nile Delta in Cairo as well. So you get a sense of how little viable land there is and how tightly these different ethnic and religious groups must be living side by side. This map gives you, these maps are usually inaccurate, and this one is too, but it's a good one to start with. Here we can see this kind of beige swathe is supposed to represent primarily Sunni communities. The areas, the top right and the top in purple represent the primarily Kurdish areas. You'll see along the coast, along the Mediterranean coast, the mountain areas are historically used to be the place where the Alawi community was concentrated. And in the south. The green areas to the south represent the Druze community. So you get a sense in which these communities are historically, I think this is particularly true historically, before this process of urbanization took place. It gives you a sense of where these different communities are located. But different maps with different levels of complexity give a better sense, perhaps, of just how localized these different communal differences are. Even in the coastal area, which, as I mentioned, has the coastal hills, very difficult place to live. Historically, this is where the impoverished Alawis lived. But even then, the coastal towns were not primarily Alawi, they were Sunni. There were also large numbers of Christians living in different parts of the coast as well. We have a variety of, you can see different Christians, large number of Christian villages in the south, the primarily Druze area. You see the green areas of the representing the Kurds, which are interspersed with Arab and other communities as well. So you get a sense in which, yes, there are certain clusters in which these communities are more tightly closer together, but really there is very little, certainly by the time we get to 2000, 2010, there's very little, it's very difficult to demarcate the lines between these areas. So was the Assad regime Alawi prior to 2011? Not really. As I mentioned, they relied on the Assad family relied on fellow Alawis in positions of power. But Sunnis and Christians were always well represented. The defense minister, the long-serving defense minister, childhood friend of Hafez al-Assad, was notably a Sunni. This was a strategic choice. It was about putting in place individuals who were loyal to the regime. It was not an ideological statement. It was not an expression of Alawi supremacism. The regime was always vocally, if it was anything, it was Arab nationalist in the way it presented itself. Arab nationalism presented a way for the different minorities in Syria to integrate themselves within the political system without theology, without sect being an issue. So it wasn't about Alawi supremacism. It was about having in place people whose loyalty could be assured, people who came from the same regional backgrounds, who shared the same social background, who shared a common worldview, who were perhaps related by ties of kinship, marriage, distant or far, or friendship. These kind of social ties built up over the years. So it's ethnic in-group solidarity. It wasn't about religion. Religion didn't really play into it at all. And it's actually debatable whether or not the Alawids are in fact Shia. This is why the Shia-Sunni argument is particularly risible. Back in the 70s, Assad, when he was facing this uprising, had a Shia cleric in Lebanon issue a fatwa stating that the Shia are good Muslims, the Alawids are good Shia, they are good Muslims, to oppose the propaganda from the Islamist insurgents he was facing at the time. But even today, there's quite a number of Ayatollahs in Iran who also look fairly skeptically about whether the Alawis actually fall within the bounds of Islam. So, this simple equation between Alawis and Shia and Iran isn't as straightforward. And in terms of geopolitics, I just want to point out the relationship between Syria and Iran has always been strategic. There's always been geopolitical. It's not about a shared Shiism. It's not about a shared worldview. It's about shared strategic values, a shared interest in using Hezbollah and maintaining some kind of influence in Lebanon. So I just wanted to throw that in. The question this argument faces is, why did sectarian violence then become so prominent in Syria? If it wasn't about the Shia-Sunni divide, three factors. Firstly, sectarian violence was a deliberate regime strategy. The regime targeted Sunni protesters with excessive violence and at the same time was presenting itself as a defender of minorities against Shiism. It was it was a strategic cultivation of sectarian violence by the regime that played a major role in sectarianization. Secondly, underlying social tensions between these different communities who are living in fairly close quarters under increasingly difficult economic circumstances led fairly naturally to suspicion and scapegoating. Once the revolution began and once this cycle of violence began, then these social tensions again fed into were escalated in certain situations and were fed into by events on the ground and violence on the ground. And thirdly, the role of what social scientists like to call sectarian entrepreneurs, in particular, the spread of Al-Qaeda elements from Iraq into Syria in roughly about 2012, a little bit 2011, 2012, brought with it a deliberate strategy of violence against disbelievers. So this is the Iraqi Al-Qaeda, which was very different in its approach from Osama bin Laden's, the kind of older generation of Al-Qaeda, if you like, which was focused very much on the on violence against the US and imperialism. The Iraqi branch of Al-Qaeda focused its targets on Shia and on Sunni Muslims, who they accused of being insufficiently pious Muslims and therefore categorized as infidels, which then opened up, the avenues for conducting violence against fellow Muslims. So this is a very different type of Al-Qaeda from that which might be more familiar, and with a much more radical and much more violent strain against other religious groups. The historical argument really became prominent after 2014, when Islamic State in Syria and Iraq declared the existence of a caliphate and declared that it had eradicated the border between Syria and Iraq, and declared in the process that in doing so, it had erased the Sykes-Picot Agreement that had created the state of the modern Middle East. Now, this declaration, which was made to great fanfare, sparked a great flurry of thinking and writing amongst Western journalists and think tankers, saying that, is this really the end? Perhaps this is the end of the states that were created in the Middle East after World War I. That what we were seeing, because of the ongoing civil war and the violence in Iraq and Syria, was the unraveling of the state system. This was quite a major remaking of the Middle East. This was a historic chapter, and this argument got a lot of attention. You will hopefully recall the Sykes-Picot Accord between Britain and France, which divvied up the Middle East between the two powers secretly during World War I, in contravention of promises that were made to the Arabs revolting against the Ottoman Empire at the time. These borders were not quite, but roughly informed the existence of modern states today. And the argument that's often made across a broad stretch of, particularly in journalism and journalists with some historical pedigree, is that the Sykes-Picot narrative, if you like, can explain the origins of conflict in Iraq and Syria in the 2000s and 2010s. The idea being that these states, these artificial states like Syria, created by France and Britain, are problematic because they group together different ethnic, religious, and tribal groups who had prior to that no real common ties. They were arbitrary creations by the colonial powers for their own purposes. This diversity, it's argued, created an inherent instability, social instability, which could only be kept together by a strong man. Saddam Hussein in Iraq, whose overthrow then unleashed violence and sectarian conflict in Iraq, Hafez al-Assad in Syria, and then Bashar al-Assad, who took over. When the strongman falters, it leads to civil war. So this is essentially the historical argument that's being put forward. Again, this is problematic, I think. Firstly, historians will always point out this is factually incorrect. The Sykes-Picot borders were not actually the borders of modern states today. And if you look at, there are specific instances where local populations had a lot more agency in determining where the borders lay than others. The city of Deir ez-Zor in Syria is part of Syria, not Iraq, because Syrians captured it and declared it part of, loyal to Damascus rather than to Baghdad. The bigger problem with this argument is that it's ahistorical. Is the suggestion that nothing has happened since the Sykes-Picot Accord? That, if you think about it, this is nearly, 100 years that these states have been in existence. Are we saying that in the course of 100 years, generations of Syrians do, in spite of the schooling, in spite of how they're brought up, in spite of the fact they are living in, and by this point for 3, 4, 5 generations have been living in the state of Syria, somehow have not generated a Syrian identity that is meaningful and important to them? Because that's not actually the case. By the time, yes, certainly for the first few decades, there were very different visions of what the Arab political community should look like. Um, by the time you get to the 1970s, those alternative visions had effectively died away. They might have remained there as part of the broader political imagination, but most people had, by and large, accepted the fact that they were Syrians. Syrian identity had its own merits, had its own existence, and its own reality. Similarly, the idea that Syria was created after World War One overlooks the fact that there was an entity called Syria prior to that. So, it's part of this. Arab intellectuals have started referring to this part of the world as Syria in the 1850s and 1860s. There was the incipient regional consciousness that this region had its own unique characteristics. The Ottoman Empire had also undergone state building that helped bring these different communities into contact with one another. The different towns and and cities of what would become Syria had been brought into contact with one another several decades prior to World War One, in a way that suggests that perhaps the longevity of Syria as a unit is due to the fact that it wasn't created ex nihilo after World War One, but actually had roots that stretch back to the mid 19th century. If we overlook what happened developments during the Ottoman Empire, then I think we're missing an important part of the story. I wrote an article about this, so something I feel quite important, passionate about. Thirdly, we're saying these states are artificial. What is an artificial state anyway? Aren't all states to some extent are artificial? Most states around the world are created by some combination of conquest and warfare. Various. There are very few, if any, naturally existing states that have not been created by some arbitrary or some process that of injustice or arbitrariness or violence. What would a non-artificial state look like? I found that a very difficult question to answer. I also think that this type of approach also prompts an unhealthy fascination with redrawing the map. The idea is, of course, or the implication of this argument is that if what's wrong in the Middle East is where the borders are today, then we can make things right by redrawing those borders. And this argument has prompted a whole genre of imaginary cartographies about the region, where Western pundits and Western journalists and Western think tankers put together what they think of as being more sensible ways in which the region might be ordered. We see simplistic maps like this, which talks about Syrian balkanization. By the looks of it, this is from the BBC, if memory serves. They talk about how one possible future for Syria might be the emergence of a Kurdish sector in the northeast, an Alawi sector along the coast in red, and a Druze sector in the south. Many problems here already. Firstly, this Kurdish sector overlooks the existence of Kurdish communities in other parts of Syria. The Alawi sector includes large areas that are not primarily Alawi, and the Druze sector includes most of the Hauran, which is Sunni rather than Druze. So some very basic areas with this one. We see other maps that suggest ways in which Syria and Iraq might be joined up. Again, we have an Alawi state, which for some reason is extended all the way to the southwest of Syria, as well as a Sunni state and Shia state, as well as a Kurdish state in the northeast, linking up the Kurdish community of Syria with the Kurdish community of Iraq, despite the fact that they speak two separate and very, if not mutually unintelligible, then somewhat difficult to reconcile dialects of Kurdish. Journalist Robin Wright in 2013 came up with another map, an Alawite Stan we see again, with a Sunni Stan in Syria and Iraq, a Kurdistan, a Shiite Stan, and the emergence of so many Stans always has me somewhat concerned. We have a Wahhabistan in Saudi Arabia, division of Yemen into two different sectors. This whole genre of different mapping the Middle East, I think, really problematic, and speaks to a certain colonial imagination of how we might divide things. If you go back prior to the Arab revolutions, then interestingly, Syria is very rarely split up. Syria looks like a much more solid and integral, resilient state. For Ralph Peters in the Armed Force Journal in 2006. Here we have a very big Yemen, a smaller Saudi Arabia, split up Iraq, a greater Jordan, which is interesting, a greater Lebanon as well. again, 2008, we have a greater Syria emerging. So the existence of these cartographies, I think, speaks to a certain arrogance in plotting ways in which the West might redraw the boundaries for the interests of people in the region without ever actually asking people in the region what they themselves want. I think this is hugely problematic. There's a nice little image there I like to show my students of how it might look from the other perspective. There's a piece published in the Wall Street Journal 2008, a Russian professor predicting the end of the US. It's different cultural divisions would tear it into areas under Chinese, Canadian, European Union or Mexico influence. Alaska's going to Russia, Hawaii is going to Japan or China. So these things are laughable. It makes you wonder why we see so many of them published at different points over the years. An environmental argument for the outbreak of the revolution in Syria would highlight the drought that hit the Northeast between 2006 and 2008. There was a huge drop-off in the annual rainfall during these years that had a very severe impact on livestock and animals. 85% of livestock died during this time. 3/4 of farms failed. There's over 1 million people affected. Something like 60 to 70% of villages in the northeast of Syria had been abandoned by 2009. Hundreds of thousands of people have migrated west to the western cities of Syria in search of ways to keep themselves and their families alive. And what was different from this, periodic drought had been a feature of northeastern Syria for many decades, of course. What was different about the severity of this drought was evident in the fact that you saw whole families relocating themselves to the outskirts of the major cities of Western Syria, rather than just the young, unemployed males, as had often been the case in the past. So this was a calamitous event by any stretch of the imagination. There's some, research was published at the time by climatologists talking about how the Syrian drought, according to this particularly well-known study published in 2015, the severity and duration of the Syrian drought, they said in the abstract, has become more than twice as likely as a consequence of human interference in the climate system. So they're making the direct connection between climate change and the Syrian drought, which then they argue fed into the origins of the uprising, and the economic difficulties, the impact on livelihoods, and so forth. They argue fed into the uprising. This argument, the problem with this, in those framed like that, it overlooks the political mismanagement of resources. It overlooks the politics of what went wrong in the Northeast. What we saw was a failure of policy, which exacerbated the impact of the drought. The irrigation pumps, which were used to produce crops in the Northeast, rose quite astronomically in the course of the 1990s and 2000s. Lowering the water table, lowering the course of the water course of the major rivers and the tributaries. The social market reforms had made it easier for rural evictions. So we had another reason contributing to the flight of people from the Northeast. Then the fuel subsidies, I'll talk about that in a second, impacted heating and irrigation. These fuel pumps were fueled by diesel and made it more expensive to run. And also the high numbers of Kurds in the northeast of Syria. There'd been an uprising in Qamishli, the city of Qamishli in the northeast in 2004 that had been very harshly dealt with. Thousands of people, 2,000 people arrested and tortured, including the torture of children as a consequence of this uprising. The northeast was under very tight security grip. There's very little political will to extend aid from the capital to the Kurdish community in particular. So all these political factors are overlooked by the environmental arguments. Fourthly, the political economy, as I mentioned, the social market economy, which was the branding given to the regime's economic reforms, its liberalization that it started to introduce in 2005. Syria, unlike other countries in the Middle East, had managed to postpone the type of economic liberalization and the type of privatizations that Egypt had begun as early as the 1970s. We'd seen this happen time and time across the region. The kind of rolling back of the state from its socialistic commitments to full employment, to nationalized industry, and the increased space of the private sector. This began in Egypt, as I said, in the 1970s. Syria did a little bit in the 80s, but managed to fend it off for various reasons until the 2000s, by which point it was long overdue. The economy was in a pretty dire state by the time Bashar got to power. The idea was, however, not to reduce the state's control of the economy, but rather to create a space for market forces and private enterprise alongside that state control. So the two spheres would exist separately. They wanted to have their cake and eat it. They wanted to create a new source of economic vitality, employment, and then money, essentially. Perhaps money rather than employment was the important thing. Without abandoning their traditional commitments to the workers and to the peasants, which had been a key part of the Ba'ath Party's legitimacy. Since the 1960s. They brought in reforms. They allowed private banking in Syria for the first time. There were opportunities for private insurance services for the first time in Syria. Trade was liberalized. Free trade agreements were signed with neighboring countries. Tourism would open up. New mobile phone licenses were issued. A whole raft of this type of legislation was passed. Even, a stock market was announced and finally opened, I think, in 2009. So a real sea change in the type of financial architecture that was in place in Syria. The dark side of this social market economy was that as it happened in the 1970s, the people who were placed to benefit from these openings were those with extremely tight political connections and kinship connections to the regime itself. Rami Makhlouf, the gentleman whose face is there, as a cousin Bashar, was one of the, was very much identified as the face of this type of liberalization. Makhlouf's father in the 80s had several top positions in state-owned industries. By the 2000s, his son targeted opportunities in the mobile phone sector, duty-free shopping, real estate, banks, and so forth. By 2005, this guy was estimated to have accumulated something like $3 billion in wealth, which you think of in a country like Syria, well, anywhere is quite amazing. In a country like Syria, it's particularly so. Also, new holding companies sprang up to mobilize more of this, more of the super rich capital and mobilize it in new ways. The people who were left behind by these economic developments were the Ba'ath Party, the state unions, popular organizations, government employees, workers and peasants, the regime's core constituents, who were not part of the new economy. As the regime moved forward with the social market economy, it ended subsidies. The cost of diesel went up overnight, something like fourfold. Cooking gas, the price of that nearly doubled. The price of basic foods, bread went up by 50%, vegetables went up by 20%. There was a 10% increase in the poverty rate from 2003, 2007, really pronounced in the northeast of Syria in particular, exacerbating the drought. Inflation by this point is at 10 or 15%. And, even so while the economic opportunities are being confined to these the super rich who are benefiting in a very ostentatious and visible way, this culture of visible consumer capitalism is very apparent in the major cities of Syria. The gap between rich and poor is becoming much more dramatic than ever before. And the people who are being left behind are these people who used to be the bedrock of the regime, people that the regime is supposed to represent. So I guess the advantage of this type of political economy approach and saying that this is what fed into the sense of rising inequality, the sense of the key constituencies being left behind, this argument gains further evidence from the fact that protesters themselves were referring to these motifs in their own chant. What you see on the screen is some screenshots from what's known as the revolutionary dabke, the dabke being a local folk dance in Syria, where the words are repurposed for the purpose of political criticism. This is during a protest that occupied a central square in Hama in 2011, talking about how the regime creates new thieves every day, these big businessmen, Shalis, Rami, and Maher. That's Rami Makhlouf and two other representatives of the regime as well. So these individuals very specifically being called out by protesters. So clearly for protesters, the economic motif is very much an inequality, amongst other things, is very much at the forefront of their mind. What the political economy approach can't explain is the timing of the uprising. Why did this take place in 2011, not 2010? What was it about 2011 that kicked the uprisings off? And it can't explain the location of the uprising. Why did the uprising begin in a small, dusty town of southwest Syria that had not suffered as much economic inequality as the northeast, for example? For that, we turn to the social movements, and this is the final argument I'm going to talk about. Social movement literature it focuses on the characteristics of protesters and how they're mobilized. It's particularly interested in the networks that exist amongst society. The suggestion is that these networks in the area of Daraa, where the revolutions started, although there was no formal opposition, although there was no deep history of opposition in Daraa, types of social relationships that existed there were really useful and transferable to beginning the revolution, beginning an uprising once it started. What you had in Daraa was a social structure that was based on clans, big families, where large families would live. Several large families lived in very close proximity within the major city of the region. You had, because of this clan-based system, a fairly conservative, patriarchal, honor-based system of gender norms. You had a high level of crime, especially smuggling. The types of skills it suggested that are useful for smuggling, getting things past security, border guards, evading detection, knowing who to bribe when you're crossing the border. These types of things are also very useful when an insurrection breaks out. Because they can be repurposed. These skill set can be repurposed for the purpose of smuggling, cell phone network cards or satellite phone cards or medical supplies or weapons or whatever it may be, and also migration. The fact that many Darawis had migrated for work to Jordan or the Gulf meant that they had one of the arguments is more exposure to freer types of discussion about politics than they might have been able to enjoy in Syria. In Daraa as well, there are also generational differences that came into play. The provincial elders, when the protests began, wanted to negotiate concessions for the regime. The youth of the city were much bolder, were inspired by the example of Egypt, were more interested in occupying the square and pushing for a more maximalist approach. And a lot of this literature emphasizes the role of emotions, how emotions can explain why people make the seemingly irrational decision to go out into the streets, to demonstrate against the regime in a country where the past experience shows that opposition will bring violent repression, may bring torture, may bring death. So this role of emotions is also something that's very prevalent in a lot of the literature. So this is the type of argument that's being presented in a large wave of scholarship on the Syria conflict. Some examples here. And you'll also see different examples of these approaches in the media, how they discussed the uprising and how they were discussing it at different points in time as well. What I think I want to suggest, and which will hopefully might be useful, is perhaps this is a good way to think about talking about conflict in different parts of the world, in Syria and elsewhere, in not simply establishing what happened, but about explaining why it happened. One of the difficulties that I have as a college professor is always encouraging my students to take that leap between explaining what happened in a particular situation, establishing the basic chain of events, and then making that step to analyzing, okay, but why did it happen? And even at the college level, thinking that their job as scholars of, as budding scholars of international affairs should be to analyze different explanations rather than simply come up with an accurate narrative about what happened, because often the facts are not in dispute. Often the facts are fairly agreed upon, fairly well agreed upon, at least for many issues. What's at dispute is, okay, what is the best explanation that we have, and what constitutes a good explanation? Is a good explanation one that is full? Is it one that accounts for as many of the facts as possible? This is the type of explanation that historians often prefer, of course. A lot of political scientists think that's not the best type of explanation. We should go for explanations which are parsimonious, that make reference to as few factors as possible in order to do the maximum amount of explaining. So a better explanation for a lot of political scientists is the one where you refer to as few factors as possible. Are we looking for an explanation that's logically coherent, that hangs together, that actually makes sense when we think it through? That's great, but of course, sometimes life is not very logical or coherent. Sometimes life, and particularly situations of confusion and uprising and people not knowing what's happening, these situations are blurry and confused, not necessarily coherent. Do we value accounts that reflect actors' own understandings of what's going on? Again, this might seem to have a lot going for it, but quite often actors, political actors, people involved in protests, involved in this type of activity, don't understand what's going on. They don't have a full picture. We often have very limited understandings of why we do things ourselves in our daily lives, and sometimes have to resort to post hoc explanations. So again, this also has its own problems. Different explanations that I've tried to suggest foreground some elements at the expense of others. I think that's a necessary part of the problem. And trying to get students to think about how they can evaluate and weigh up different types of arguments is something that I'm always keen to do in my own teaching. And I encourage them to think about historical arguments about why things happen as a lawyer might, thinking about the evidence that's involved in these arguments, thinking about what these arguments emit, thinking about the oversights, thinking about elements of contradiction, how different arguments may result in different implications with real world consequences, as my example of the map showed. I think that's all I wanted to say. I'm afraid I have gone over time quite badly, so I apologize for that. But yes, I had a lot of slides, so I'm but happy to take any questions if we have any.
Yes, please. No, I told you early, there's no time limit, and there was no way I was going to, give you a timeout on that one. So, if anybody has any questions, you can type them in the chat, or you can unmute. You can turn your camera on. This was amazing. I have a lot to learn.
I covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
I wanted to I was told to put in very little academic jargon, so I made up for that with lots of slides and speaking very quickly.
Well, and of course, you're talking to geographers, so the maps pulled us right in.
Maps are wonderful.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm happy to take questions if there are any points that I didn't explain clearly, or if you'd like me to elaborate on anything, or go back to any other slides. I'm happy to do any of that if that would be useful.
I'm not seeing anything. So we'll just say that they're processing and internalizing this information. And Celeste says, thank you. Your presentation was incredible. And I second that. So thank you, Daniel, so much for giving up some of your time tonight, and for helping us understand this complex happening in the part of the world that is very complex. So if there are no questions, I bid everybody thank you, and a good night to everyone. And again, Daniel, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. Could I just add that if people do have questions after perhaps watching the video at a later stage, then feel free to reach out to me. I'm also happy to recommend readings of different levels of complexity, background to Syria, introductory, things that might be useful for students as well. Or so do feel free to reach out to me if I can help with direct you to
Perfect.
resources.
Yes, I will definitely follow up with you on that because I can link some of those resources to the recording of this when we post it. So that'll be very helpful.
And if I may make a quick cheeky plug for my new book that I am finishing writing at the moment. I've been writing for several years. Well, it's coming out next year. A book on the making of modern Syria from the 1800s to the 2020s. So a book that I'm writing for a general audience that will give a little bit of a less, a little bit of a slower account of some of the developments I'm talking about. It's an account of how Syria got to where it was today from where it was 200 years ago. So looking at these processes of change and economic change and how different parts of Syria became connected to each other over the course of these developments of state building over the last 200 years.
Absolutely. Thank you. I have it written down and I'll add it to that pile back there. So again, thank you so much, Daniel. Thanks for those of you who attended. I appreciate you being here tonight, and I hope everybody has a great evening.